The rise of the modern role-playing game. That may seem unnecessarily aggrandizing, but it's true. The Dragon Quest series created an entirely new subgenre of RPG, the Japanese role-playing game, also known as the console role-playing game. Imperfect terms that nonetheless capture the characteristics of these titles. This in turn exposed millions of people worldwide to RPGs for the first time, and set in stone many conventions used to this very day. A time when development houses focused all their talent on these relatively simple two-dimensional games, allowing more resources to be allocated to gameplay, writing, and music. And it all began with Dragon Quest. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me guide you through the groundwork that culminated in the rise of the RPG. Looking back, the very first video game RPGs were naturally based off of the most popular tabletop RPG of all time, Dungeons & Dragons, which was officially released in 1974. The real innovation here was the focus of play narrowing down from armies to small bands of adventurers. While Gygax and Arneson enjoyed moving armies around the battlefield, they desired a method to play out the stories of the individual heroes that might make up those armies. Thus, D&D codified a set of rules that let players create a relatively small party of characters and take them out on fantastic adventures. As the first tabletop RPG with any sort of wide commercial release, D&D established conventions that still define the genre. Experience points, levels, vital stats, hit points, classes, interchangeable weapons and armor. These rules can still be seen in virtually all RPGs today, whether they're played on the dining room table or over the internet. And in fact, these conventions can be considered vital to the very definition of an RPG. Though D&D was by nature open-ended, and required a human brain to control the world and all the non-player characters within it, it didn't take long for fans with computer programming expertise to try their hand at a software version of the game that they loved. The earliest examples actually come from 1974, the same year that Dungeons & Dragons was released. These include D&D, all small case letters, which had character stats and a level up system based on experience points, as well as Dungeon, which allowed players to create a whole party of adventurers. These were obviously very rudimentary programs, built using mainframes at Southern Illinois University and Claremont Graduate University, respectively. But they showed the first glimmer of life for video game RPGs, and their contributions shouldn't be ignored. Several D&D-inspired homebrew games were created throughout the 70s, generally on mainframes that were networked between universities and other such institutions that could afford the expense. Unfortunately, a lot of these early attempts have been lost to the ether, since administrators were known to delete such games as unnecessary wastes of resources. Each of these games were underground successes, at least locally, but by their very nature were precluded from escaping the constraint of mainframe networks and becoming hits in the outside world. However, the rise of the personal computer meant that those limitations didn't last long. One of the first video game RPGs released for the home computer was Akalabeth, created for the Apple II by Richard Garriott around 1979, who was in high school at the time. It was initially a project inspired by weekly D&D sessions that he ran. The central mode of gameplay in Akalabeth featured a wireframe first-person dungeon crawl, but it also switched perspectives to a top-down view when traveling on the overworld map. In addition, players had stats, such as strength and dexterity, which could be raised depending on how many monsters they slew in the dungeon. There were weapons and other gear available, and you had the choice of playing as either a fighter or a magi, rudimentary class selection capabilities. As you can see, though the game lacks sophistication, certain elements of D&D were successfully brought over and set in the burgeoning world of video game RPGs. Garriott released an indirect successor, Ultima, in 1981, and Ultima II in 1982. While not technically true sequels to Akalabeth, these games expanded quite a bit on the proto-RPG gameplay that Garriott initially developed. The top-down overworld perspective is kept intact, however, great strides were made visually with the integration of tiled graphics. Gone were the sparse overhead maps of Akalabeth. The world actually started to resemble the fantasy setting it was based off of. Furthermore, movement was made simpler by allowing single keystrokes to control the character, as opposed to a parser scheme where you had to type out the direction of each movement. Meanwhile, in a mirror of the Final Fantasy Dragon Quest dichotomy that later played out in the console realm, Ultima quickly found a rival in the equally influential Wizardry series. Released in 1981, Wizardry set itself apart from Ultima in several ways. First off, it was very much a dungeon crawl, with the game consisting of 10 progressively more difficult levels. There was a story, but it didn't factor too much into the gameplay at all. However, the layout was much more intuitive and graphically impressive, including colorful monster graphics. A large portion of the screen gave the player relevant information, while the top left corner created a first-person perspective of the dungeon, not unlike a Akalabeth. One important step forward was the implementation of a party of characters, as opposed to just one like in the first couple Ultima games. And though players might feel overconfident with this wealth of characters at their command, the game was punishing. If your whole party died, there was no way to pick up where you left off. It was back to the beginning with you. While not an expansive game, Wizardry introduced some important staples of the genre, and the series saw few overall changes in its direct sequels, Wizardry 2 in 1982 and Wizardry 3 in 1983. Where Surtech found a formula that worked and stuck with it, Richard Garriott became famous for constantly tinkering with his sequels, refusing to use the same game engine in each successively numbered Ultima game. Ultima and Wizardry series that held the most clout early on and gave birth to the modern video game RPG. And it's from this point where our story moves across the Pacific to the land of the rising sun. Add to that the Famicom's relatively simple input device, at least compared to a PC, and it was determined that in order to bring the RPG to the masses, everything needed to be streamlined. In essence, turn this into this. With those guiding principles in mind, all the parts were put together and Dragon Quest was released on May 27, 1986. Focus was on enjoying your role in this fantastic world, not tweaking out your characters or mastering every dungeon. Over 2.4 million copies were sold in Japan. The mania was such that a very stubborn rumor was born of it. Supposedly, the Kokai, or legislative body of Japan, decreed that all future Dragon Quest games had to be released on a Sunday or national holiday in order to prevent the country from essentially shutting down. It makes for great video game lore, but it's sadly untrue. Regardless, it was a smash hit, selling almost 3.8 million copies in Japan. To put that in perspective, Super Mario Bros. 3 sold 4 million copies after it was released later that year. Similar to how American parents might have yelled at their kids to stop playing that damn Mario, meaning any platformer. It was right around this time that a small Japanese development studio named Square got into the RPG game. Hironobu Sakaguchi was a university student in 1983 when he quit to join Square at its inception. With the success of Dragon Quest, Sakaguchi convinced the president of Square to let his last game be an RPG. Supposedly, since this was supposed to be his final project with Square, he named it Final Fantasy. While developing the scenario, Sakaguchi looked at Dragon Quest and saw its plot as overly formulaic. Again, he went out of his way to create a contrast. The main goals of Dragon Quest were to rescue the princess and defeat a bad guy threatening the kingdom. In Final Fantasy, you do both of those things within the first 20 minutes, before the title screen even pops up. Regardless, the gameplay was still more similar to Dragon Quest than Wizardry or Ultima. Even with class choice, customization was relatively limited, and the player took on a role in a grand yet linear story as opposed to partaking in an open-ended experience. Final Fantasy was released on the Famicom in December of 1987, just a couple of months before Dragon Quest III. The relatively more complicated plot was perhaps a bit too convoluted, involving a time loop that makes less sense each time you run through it. Involving a time loop that makes less sense each time you run through it. Involving a time loop that makes less sense each time you run through it. But it did provide enough of an interesting alternative to Dragon Quest that it forged its own place in the market. Though the Ultima and Wizardry series continued on and had relative success on the PC platform, and even on some consoles, their sales numbers never achieved the worldwide success of JRPGs, which by the mid-90s were at their critical peak with games like Final Fantasy VI and Chrono Trigger, which, in fact, was a time when WRPGs stagnated, only to find new heights via a renaissance in the late 90s via series like Baldur's Gate, Fallout, and The Elder Scrolls. Back in the East, after a series of missteps involving money-hemorrhaging forays into online gaming and movie production, Square was saved by Enix, its valiant Dragon Warrior. The two companies merged in 2003, an event that sent shockwaves through Japan. Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest continue on as they always have, with Final Fantasy constantly reinventing themselves, and Dragon Quest is the ever-present rock that you can always rely on. Both still pillars of the subgenre.